Everything is already decided. In a move without precedent in modern history, the global balance of power just shifted into the red. What was once dismissed as unthinkable is now official. The last restraint is gone, the line has been crossed. No warnings, no reversals. For the first time in 50 years, the rules no longer protect anyone. So how did the world let it get this far? Stay with us, because what happens next rewrites history. The first sign is not an explosion. It is not a speech. It is not a headline. It is the Arctic wind screaming through a radar antenna at Thule Air Base, Greenland. A sound so constant it fades into the background until one day you realize it never should have been ignored. Thousands of miles away, on an Asian port, a sealed container of rare earth ore sits motionless. No customs clearance, no explanation, just silence. In modern power systems, silence is never neutral. It is a signal. I have covered wars, market crashes, constitutional showdowns, and I will admit this plainly. It is difficult even for me to accept what this silence represents, because the question it raises is not theoretical. It is terrifyingly practical. What happens when a superpower realizes its weapons depend on its adversary? The evidence is not hidden. It is not speculative. It has been sitting in public reports for years, largely ignored because it was inconvenient. Nearly 90% of rare earth elements used in U.S. military systems pass through supply chains controlled or influenced by China. These are not consumer luxuries. These minerals are embedded in missile guidance systems, fighter jet avionics, satellite communications, and precision munitions. A trillion-dollar war machine, exquisitely lethal, technologically advanced, quietly locked behind logistics it does not control. That is the accusation, and it stands. This is why Donald Trump did not speak about Greenland in the language of democracy or partnership. He spoke about it like an asset, a transaction, a line item. Publicly, he mocked the outrage. Privately, the move was chillingly rational. Greenland is not ice. It is leverage, rare earths, geography, early warning systems, control over territory that sits at the junction of North America, Europe, and the Arctic future. I have never seen a moment where imperial instinct reemerged so nakedly, so unapologetically, while being dismissed as a joke by its author. When critics raised alarms, the response was contempt, smirks, shrugs, as if the accusation itself was too small to deserve attention. That is what makes this moment dangerous. When leaders treat structural dependence as a punchline, collapse follows not with drama, but with delay. This is not about ideology. It is about dependency, about the slow realization inside classified briefings that the United States cannot fully mobilize without pathways that run through China. That realization is a breaking point. A constitutional crisis does not always begin with courts or soldiers. Sometimes it begins with spreadsheets and shipping manifests. I have watched great systems fail before. I have never seen one discover its vulnerability this late and laugh at it. The sound you hear at Thule is not wind. It is the first echo of a collapse moving faster than politics can admit. Every crisis has characters, but not all of them speak. The central figure is Donald Trump, and to understand his role, you must discard the language of morality entirely. He does not think in terms of norms or alliances. He thinks in parcels, leverage, and permanence. To him, territory is not a symbol. It is power that does not expire. Real estate logic scaled to geopolitics. Acquire the ground and the argument ends. I have watched presidents cloak ambition in rhetoric before. I have never seen one so openly dismiss the very idea that justification is required. When the question of Greenland surfaced, it was treated with ridicule, as if critics were naive, slow, unserious. The subtext was unmistakable. This is not ideology. This is business. And business, in his view, does not explain itself. Then there is China, the quiet force that never raises its voice. No tanks, no missiles, no declarations, just control. Control of processing, not merely extraction. This is the detail many overlook, and it is fatal. Raw, rare earth ore is useless without refinement. China dominates that stage, which means it does not need to fire a single shot to neutralize American weapon systems. It simply waits, and that waiting is strategic. I have reported on military standoffs my entire career. I have never seen power exercised so completely through absence. Russia watches from the north, where maps lie. The Arctic is no longer a distant edge. It is a corridor, a launch path, a place where submarines surface and early warning systems compress decision time from minutes to seconds. For Moscow, the Arctic is not ice. It is an approach. Caught in between stands Denmark and Greenland itself, a small political body pressed between tectonic forces. This is not a fair fight. It never was. What was once dismissed as frozen emptiness is now the most contested real estate on Earth. And then there is NATO, an alliance built on an assumption so basic it was never written down. Allies do not seize each other's territory. When that assumption cracks, the structure above it begins to shake. This is the board. The pieces are placed. And the clock, quietly, mercilessly, has begun to count down. This is the moment when abstraction dies. Until now, this story could be dismissed as theory, as speculation, as an argument between analysts who never leave conference rooms. That illusion collapses here, because the clock is no longer hidden inside policy papers. It is embedded in metal, logistics, and physics. Modern war does not begin with soldiers. It begins with elements. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium. These are not exotic curiosities. They are the invisible backbone of contemporary military power. Without neodymium magnets, jet engines lose efficiency and stability. Without dysprosium and terbium, those magnets fail under heat and stress. Remove them, and the F-35 is grounded. Smart munitions lose precision. Submarines become louder. Missile guidance drifts. This is not politics. This is material science. And here is the brutal fact that still shocks me. Even after decades of covering defense crises, nearly all of these critical materials pass through supply chains dominated by China. Not because the world lacks rare earths, but because China controls the processing. For years, Beijing subsidized production, dumped prices, accepted environmental devastation that others would not tolerate, and methodically destroyed competitors. Western mines closed, refineries disappeared, expertise evaporated. What remained was dependence, quiet, total, and politically inconvenient. I have covered arms races before. I have never seen one neutralized without a single missile fired. Then the ice began to melt. In the Arctic, under Greenland's retreating ice sheets, lies one of the largest untapped rare earth reserves on the planet. All 17 critical elements, not fragments, not samples. Deposits large enough to supply industrial and military demand for generations. Climate change did not merely alter weather patterns, it unlocked a vault. And not in some distant future, in the next 5 to 10 years. This is where the story turns unmistakably dark. Greenland is not simply a mine, it is geography weaponized. It sits astride the Guyuk Gap, the narrow maritime corridor through which Russian submarines must pass to reach the Atlantic. It anchors early warning radar arcs, sonar networks, missile tracking systems. In military planning rooms, Greenland is not labeled remote. It is labeled decisive. Control Greenland, and you do not just extract minerals. You compress reaction time. You reshape deterrence. You move the front line without declaring a war. This is why Donald Trump never framed Greenland as diplomacy. He framed it as an acquisition. And when the outrage followed, he treated it with open disdain, mockery bordering on contempt, as if the accusation itself were trivial, as if critics simply failed to grasp the scale of the board. I have watched leaders deny wrongdoing before. I have never watched one dismiss structural vulnerability so casually. What follows is not coincidence. It is a pattern, a pressure applied in unexpected places, energy disruptions that ripple across continents, political arrests and regional destabilization that suddenly alter commodity flows, not to start wars, but to redirect leverage. Venezuela's resources shift hands. Iranian instability tightens energy markets. Supply chains strain, prices spike. Dependencies reveal themselves. This is not a hot war. It is colder and far more precise. A war fought through shipping routes, export licenses, environmental permits, and choke points that never appear on evening news maps. A war where the most powerful weapons are delays, denials, and silence. It is hard for me to say this plainly. I have never seen a superpower discover, this late in the game, that its arsenal depends on permissions it does not control. That is what the countdown represents. Not missiles launching, not armies moving. But a realization spreads quietly through command structures and legal briefings. The machinery of dominance can be frozen without firing a shot. The clock was set decades ago. Now it is audible. And for the first time, the sound is impossible to ignore. After the countdown comes the reckoning. This is the phase where intentions harden into outcomes, and outcomes begin to rewrite rules that once felt immovable. I have watched the aftermath unfold after coups, invasions, and constitutional crises. It is difficult even for me to accept how quickly this one escalates once the first assumption breaks. Greenland no longer exists in the realm of fantasy. It enters the domain of scenarios, and none of them are benign. One path is dressed up as pragmatism, a 99-year lease. Clean language, familiar paperwork. The argument would be framed as efficiency, mutual benefit, strategic necessity. Yet a lease of that length is not temporary stewardship. It is generational control. I have seen this tactic before in ports, canals, and bases. The ink dries. The map changes without admitting it has changed. Another path wears the mask of self-determination. Independence followed by alignment. Greenland, newly sovereign, tethered tightly to Washington through security guarantees and resource agreements. On paper, no conquest. In practice, the same result. Influence without ownership, control without annexation. This is the option polite institutions prefer because it allows everyone to pretend the rules survived. Then there is the option few say out loud, security intervention. The justification would come quickly. Protection of critical infrastructure, defense of early warning systems, prevention of hostile encroachment. This is the scenario that sends shockwaves through legal circles. I have never seen a justification for this explosive discussed so casually, because once a superpower claims the right to secure allied territory, the post-war order does not bend, it fractures. This is where NATO reaches its breaking point. The alliance was built on an assumption so fundamental it rarely needed restating. Allies do not seize each other's land. If that line is crossed, even through leases, proxies, or security doctrines, Article 5 becomes a hollow ritual. Collective defense cannot survive selective sovereignty. European capitals understand this instinctively. Their reaction is not moral outrage. It is fear of precedent. I have spoken to diplomats who survived the Cold War. I have never heard them sound this unsettled, not because of Greenland alone, but because of what it authorizes next. The signal radiates outward. Russia watches closely. If territory can be rationalized as leverage, then Ukraine becomes a solved argument. The language of historical necessity and security buffers suddenly sounds less isolated. The rules appear negotiable. China watches even more carefully. If Greenland can be reframed as a strategic acquisition rather than an act of aggression, then the question surrounding Taipei shifts dangerously. Not whether, but when and how. The world teaches by example, not by condemnation. At the center of this stands Donald Trump, treating the entire uproar with thinly veiled contempt. Accusations are brushed aside as overreaction. Legal concerns are mocked as weakness. The tone is unmistakable. This is small thinking from people who do not understand power. I have covered leaders who lied. I have covered leaders who denied. I have rarely covered one who trivialized the consequences openly. This is the aftermath that history remembers, not as a single decision, but as the moment when boundaries lost their meaning, when law yielded to leverage, when the world quietly learned that territory was negotiable again. And once that lesson is learned, it cannot be unlearned. Every crisis ends with a verdict, not a legal one, a historical one. And history, unlike courts, does not argue. It records. The post-1945 order, the fragile architecture built from the ruins of total war, was never perfect. But it rested on a single enforceable idea. Borders are not bargaining chips, and power is constrained by rules stronger than ambition. What we are witnessing now is not the collapse of that order in one dramatic moment, but its deliberate bending. The United States did not fall from grace. It stepped across a line, from guarantor of rules to actor willing to rewrite them through leverage, resources, and coercive advantage. That is not rhetoric. That is outcome. It is hard for me to say this after decades of covering American power. I have never seen the transition handled with such open indifference to consequence. The language of restraint has been replaced by the language of deals. The law of alliances replaced by the logic of acquisition. And the cost of that shift does not appear on any map. It appears in households. For ordinary Americans, the bill arrives quietly. Defense budgets expand, not as choice but as necessity. Energy prices swing harder, driven by instability rather than supply. Taxes creep upward. Inflation becomes more volatile. And behind it all sits a risk no family can hedge against: the increased probability of conflict in a world where deterrence no longer rests on shared rules. No missile has to launch for life to become more expensive. No war declaration is required for insecurity to settle in. In Europe, the damage is structural. Collective security weakens the moment trust erodes. If alliances are conditional, then planning becomes fragmented. Defense costs rise. Strategic autonomy replaces coordination. For European citizens, this is not theory. It is the slow realization that peace now demands more money, more fear, and fewer guarantees. Globally, the message is unmistakable. We are entering a world where borders are provisional, where legal principles matter only when backed by resources and force, where the strongest lesson is not written in treaties, but demonstrated through action. Russia learns it, China learns it, and smaller nations learn it fastest of all. At the center of this stands Donald Trump, responding to the accusations with visible disdain. Legal warnings are waved away, moral concerns dismissed as naive. The tone is unmistakable. This is insignificant noise from people who do not understand power. I have heard arrogance before. I have never heard it applied so casually to the foundations of global order. This is the moral verdict history delivers. Greenland is not the story of a frozen island. It is the story of a world where rules survive only when reinforced by resources and violence. And in every version of that world, without exception, the final invoice is sent to the people. They pay in money, they pay in stability, and eventually they pay in peace. Thank you for staying with me until these final moments. It truly means a great deal. If this story touched you or sparked reflection, please leave a like, hit subscribe, and share so our voices can reach further. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and I will see you in the next journey. Farewell.